I and others like me have been arguing for a long time that one of the biggest challenges of living at this time and in this place is that an increasing number of us are living without big stories, big narratives, the scholars like to call them, big stories that guide our lives and call us to higher purposes. More and more, you and I are settling for stories that are primarily about us. Our personal careers, our power, our money, our opinions, our feelings, our grievances. Now, don't get me wrong, your story is probably fascinating. I'm sure it is. I know it is. You, your spouse, and your 1.7 kids are likely an interesting study. And what you feel is really worth noting. And yes, your opinion may be well-spoken, well-articulated, well-formed, but truthfully, it's just your opinion. And what you feel will come and go. And honestly, I hate to tell you this, your little story is somewhat parochial. I mean, how much of the world have you really experienced? There were members of my family, as I've shared before, who didn't like making left turns. So where they went was often shaped by the routes where left turns weren't necessary. Do I want to build my world around a no left turn theology? Our small stories, while important, are not enough for a full life, for a life that can connect us to big purposes and to people all over the world, a life that can call us beyond our natural tendency to view the world through the lens of our small and sometimes very needy selves. I love what Richard Rohr says regarding what happens when we don't see big patterns in life, when we don't participate in big stories. He says the world becomes disenchanted. The world becomes disenchanted. The enchantment of life begins to be lost. One of the things I really like about being around my grandson is that he's so enchanted by everything and everybody. Well, increasingly, we're living in a land that we're being disenchanted. Rohr also says that when we have no big patterns or big stories, what is left is merely the private ego with its own attempts at episodic meaning and control. When there are no patterns in life, when there are no big stories, it becomes all about me, and once in a while I figure out some kind of meaning episodically from my me stories. If the Bible is anything, it is an invitation into a bigger story. A larger narrative. The Book of Deuteronomy, in our first reading for today, and one of my favorite readings of all time, makes that abundantly clear. The Bible is about larger stories. This reading involves instructions to the people of Israel, who are said now to be entering the Promised Land. And when they enter the land, which is said, by the way, and this is quite important, when they enter the land, which is God's gift to them, they are to take an offering, some of the first fruit of the ground, to a worship center and offer it to a leader of the big story, the priest. And as they offer it, they are to tell their people's story. Not their private story, but their people's story. And they're to start with words like this. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. And by the way, that ancestor is Jacob. He went to Egypt. And note this next line. This is their big story. He went to Egypt where he was an alien. So note how the big story begins. We recognize that we come from a long line of wanderers. And we come from a people who know what it means not to be at home, to be foreigners, to be immigrants, to be aliens. You got to get this. You got to tell this part of the story, or you might think that when you confront foreigners and immigrants in your land that is now your home, you may say something totally inappropriate like this: why should I welcome them? They need to be kept out. No room for foreigners. I remember a book that we used to read to, I think, Jacob, our son, and then to Liam. No girls allowed. No girls allowed. No foreigners allowed. Well, if you say that, by the way, you have forgotten your story. If you say that, you have forgotten that you come from a long line of people who know what it means to not have a home. Samaritas, formerly Lutheran Social Services of Michigan, spends a lot of time and money settling refugees because why? It knows the big story out of which we operate. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. He went down to Egypt, where he was an alien. Now, we were aliens, but we grew in number. We didn't let our foreign status stop us. We were resilient. But yes, those doggone Egyptians were threatened by us. They treated us harshly, imposing hard labor on us. Our big story includes a lot of pain. It wasn't all roses. Our big story included oppression. Hey, if you don't know that part of the story, you might be surprised when life brings you suffering. You might be taken off guard by oppression. It's simply a part of the story. Big, bully empires show up all the time. The emperors, the pharaohs, well, their names just change. And while the big story doesn't say this, don't be surprised when you become a part of an empire that oppresses. It happens. It's easy to name the other folks, the Egyptians, but let's face it, when you and your people get in charge, you become a lot like the Egyptians. We Americans need to be reminded of this sometimes. The Egyptians treated us harshly, but we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our cries, saw our affliction. The big story that you and I participate in tells us that God is on the side of freedom. The big story is a story of salvation. Another word for that is rescue. Rescue from oppression. Note this, Ukrainians. Note this, Putin. Note this, alcoholics and drug-dependent people. Note this, wives or husbands who are abused by your spouses. Note this, who can't seem to move out of the wrong that was done to you. Note this, you for whom shame is a constant companion. Note this, you whose lack of self-worth is keeping you confined to the couch and home and away from risk. The big story that you are a part of is a story about a God who saves, a God who rescues, a God who sets free. Come on, God, come and set the Ukrainians free. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and He brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Our story includes a part about how we made it to the other side. Sometimes you think you're not going to. Sometimes you're afraid you're going to stay stuck in the land of oppression. But our story is of a people who made it to the other side. Remember that when you wonder if you're going to make it to the other side of grief. Remember that when you wonder if you're going to make it to the other side of shame, the other side of divorce, the other side of addiction. Our people, they made it to the other side. Our people, The people of our big story are cheering the Ukrainians and us on. So in light of all this, I'm bringing an offering. I'm a part of a big narrative, a big story that brings me to gratitude. Gratitude, not entitlement, is my people's story. I have to say that when the story is simply about me and mine, gratitude has a tendency to get lost. My accomplishments, my stock portfolio, my notoriety, what I have to pay at the pump, my ego, ho hum. There's little room for gratitude in all of that mineness. But we are a part of a bigger story, a story that doesn't leave me out, by the way, but places me within a much larger story, a story about gift and rescue, a story that naturally leads to gratitude, and gratitude naturally becomes generosity. Now, after you bring the offering to the priest, you throw a party. The big story compels us into feasting. Our big narrative is not about some serious dourness or all life of seriousness. This is a narrative that wants us to have fun. But I want you to note who's included in the fun. This is a great part of the text. I want you to know who's been invited to the party. The Levites and the aliens. The Levites, I'm feeling pretty good about that because that's me. The Levites are the religious leaders who don't own property. The aliens are the foreigners who are there for whatever reason. War, famine, climate change, family struggles, we don't know. The reason doesn't matter. But the party is to include them. They are to share in the bounty. Generosity will characterize those who participate in the big story. To not be generous is to not know our story. We've begun Lent this week, in case you didn't know. And for me, I got to tell you, no other time of the year invites us into our big story as does Lent. In Lent, we're being taken into the big story with Jesus. And you'll note, by the way, that our big story in Lent begins in the wilderness. Come on. The wilderness is where a lot of us spend our time. So don't be surprised by time spent in the wilderness. You'll note, by the way, that the great heroes of mythology always spent time there. Wondering and wandering are integral parts of meaningful lives. Yes, it's very true. If you don't want to go very deep, you may be able to avoid the wilderness. Those who want to skim over life, remain in the shallow end of the pool, can perhaps stay away from it. And some people try to do that. They'll make life all about their money, their achievements, their easy answers, allowing nothing to question them or change them. But a deeper life that is full, life that is connected to the big story, won't allow opting out of the wilderness. It's a part of the story. You got to go there. Which is to say, Lent is a necessary part of the journey. Now, as you well know, Lent will take us into death, and we'd rather not go there, just as we'd rather not go into the wilderness, but we must. It's a part of our story. It's a part of the pattern. We hold the death of the Lord deep in our hearts, says one of our favorite hymns. For to live with the Lord, we must die with the Lord. Yeah, the end of the story is resurrection, as I said last week. There is no resurrection without death. It's a part of the pattern. It's a part of the big story. Death is necessary. And you know what? The longer I've done this work, the more I realize that you know that. You know that deep inside. It's a part of the reason so many of you show up on Ash Wednesday. You know the pattern. You've experienced it. In some way, some crazy way, you want to be reminded of it. Conversation with my son this past week after he attended an Ash Wednesday service was phenomenally helpful to me. I told him that, believe it or not, people want to hear the bad news that the church brings on Ash Wednesday. Bad news like, you're going to die and you're broken. We want to hear that. And he agreed with me and then proceeded to say, emphasizing the role of the church, where else will they get that news? Who else is going to tell the truth? The culture certainly won't. Facing your mortality and your sinfulness, your brokenness, may cause you to live differently. And to live differently may challenge the values of the culture and eventually may even impact the economy. Welcome to Lent. Lent is meant for participants, not spectators. Lent will reveal the big pattern, the big story: life, death, resurrection. These 40 days focused on death will be tough. And we might feel we're out in the wilderness. But note, as Luke says about Jesus, we can say about us, while in the wilderness, we will be led by the Spirit. The Spirit who will accompany us in death and in life. Amen.